How to make an avoidant miss you like crazy isn't really about tricks, timing, or playing games. It's about understanding a very specific emotional system that reacts to distance in a completely different way than most people expect. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: most people only learn after getting hurt. The more you chase, the less space you leave for memory, reflection, and emotional contrast to form. And without that contrast, there is nothing for someone to miss. It's like trying to make someone remember a song that never stops playing in the background. Eventually, it just becomes noise they stop noticing. But when silence enters in the right way, not as punishment but as emotional breathing room, something very different begins to happen in the avoidant mind. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly, in a way that builds tension through absence rather than presence. And if you've ever been in that confusing space where someone seemed to care deeply one moment and emotionally distant the next, you already know how disorienting it feels trying to make sense of that rhythm while still wanting closeness. Before anything else, though, make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming next isn't surface-level advice. It's the kind of psychological clarity that changes how you see attachment dynamics completely, and once you see it, you don't really go back to guessing anymore. To understand how to make an avoidant miss you, you first have to understand why missing someone doesn't automatically happen just because distance exists. For many people, absence naturally creates emotional longing, but avoidant attachment doesn't process emotional distance in the same linear way. Instead of absence creating immediate longing, it often creates relief first. Relief from pressure, relief from emotional intensity, relief from the internal sense of being emotionally engaged in a way that feels demanding. That doesn't mean they don't care, it means their nervous system interprets closeness and emotional availability differently. So when someone stays constantly present, constantly expressive, constantly available, the emotional system doesn't get the contrast it needs to register value over time. Everything blends into consistency, and consistency without space stops standing out emotionally. This is why so many people unintentionally reduce their own emotional impact by trying to stay too accessible, too reassuring, too there all the time, thinking it will create closeness, when in reality it often removes the very tension that creates emotional memory in the first place. And this is where the core mistake begins to form: the belief that more effort automatically creates more attachment. So when someone starts pulling away, the instinct is usually to close the gap immediately. More messages, more checking in, more explaining, more emotional availability, as if consistency alone can rebuild emotional connection. But what actually happens in avoidant dynamics is almost the opposite. The more emotional pressure builds on one side, the more the other side unconsciously associates the connection with internal activation that feels overwhelming rather than grounding. And so instead of increasing closeness, pursuit often compresses emotional space even further, leaving no room for reflection or desire to form naturally. This is why chasing energy doesn't just fail, it actively reshapes how you are emotionally perceived in the moment. You shift from being experienced as a presence that is freely chosen to a presence that feels constantly approaching, and that difference changes everything about emotional response. But the real paradox, the one most people don't realize until much later, is that missing someone doesn't come from closeness or distance alone. It comes from contrast. The emotional system needs both presence and absence to create comparison, and without comparison, emotional value doesn't get properly registered. Think of it like light and shadow. Without one, the other loses definition. If someone is always available, always emotionally consistent, always reachable, there is no emotional gap for the mind to revisit later. But when there is intentional space, not chaotic silence, not emotional punishment, but calm, grounded distance, the mind is forced to reorganize perception. It starts filling in the absence, not with panic, but with awareness. And that's where the shift begins, not in immediate longing, but in delayed recognition. The realization that something once present is no longer automatically accessible, and that change, more than anything, is what creates emotional weight in memory. Which leads directly into the first key trigger: sudden emotional distance, but done in the right way, not disappearing out of frustration, not withdrawing in emotional protest, but stepping back in a way that is calm, stable, and internally grounded. Because the goal here is not to create confusion, it's to create contrast. When your emotional presence was once constant and then becomes naturally less accessible, the avoidance system is given space to recalibrate without feeling pressured. And in that space, something subtle begins to happen. They start noticing the absence of your emotional energy, not because you forced them to, but because the pattern they got used to is no longer automatically available. And when something familiar becomes slightly less predictable, the mind doesn't immediately label it as loss, but it does start registering it as change. And change in emotional memory is where curiosity quietly begins to form long before missing ever consciously appears. And once that initial shift in emotional availability is introduced, the real change doesn't come from the distance itself. It comes from what that distance removes from the emotional environment. Because when someone is used to consistent access to your attention, your responses, your emotional presence, it stops being consciously appreciated and starts becoming an assumed background layer of their life. And the moment that layer becomes less automatic, the mind is forced to adjust. Not emotionally at first, but cognitively. They notice timing differently, they notice gaps more sharply. They start registering moments where they expected a familiar rhythm from you but instead encounter silence or neutrality. And this is where emotional psychology becomes very subtle, because absence alone is not what creates longing, it is the interruption of pattern. The brain is wired to predict emotional consistency, and when that prediction is slightly disrupted, it doesn't immediately create missing, it creates awareness. And awareness is the first quiet step toward emotional recalibration. But here's where most people get this wrong after introducing distance. They think the goal is to become cold or unavailable in an extreme way. In reality, that often collapses the entire dynamic instead of reshaping it. Because sudden emotional withdrawal without grounding can trigger rejection rather than reflection. What actually creates emotional pull is not chaos but stability within distance. A version of you that is still calm, still centered, still emotionally composed, but no longer constantly extending access. That combination creates a very specific psychological tension. You are still emotionally recognizable, but no longer fully reachable on demand. And that difference matters more than people realize. Because when access becomes slightly less predictable, attention becomes slightly more valuable, not because it was taken away aggressively, but because it is no longer guaranteed in the same way. And this is where the second trigger begins to form: emotional neutrality. Not emotional emptiness, not detachment for the sake of punishment, but a grounded shift away from reactive emotional intensity. Because one of the strongest patterns that pushes avoidant dynamics into withdrawal is emotional escalation that feels like pressure rather than connection. When emotional conversations become highly charged, highly explanatory, or highly seeking of reassurance, the internal experience on the avoidant side often becomes overloaded. Not because the feelings are wrong, but because the intensity removes their sense of internal control over emotional pacing. So when you shift into emotional neutrality, something unexpected happens. The emotional system no longer feels like it is being pulled into escalation. Instead, it encounters steadiness, and steadiness, especially after intensity, creates a different kind of curiosity, not immediate longing, but observational awareness. They begin to notice that your emotional state is no longer dependent on their immediate response, and that shift subtly repositions you in their internal hierarchy, not as someone chasing regulation, but as someone maintaining it independently. As this neutrality stabilizes, something even more important begins to happen in the background. The dynamic of control starts to shift without any explicit confrontation. Because in avoidant attachment patterns, control isn't about dominance, it's about emotional autonomy. When someone feels like emotional closeness requires constant negotiation or pressure, they tend to withdraw to restore that autonomy. But when emotional presence becomes calm, steady, and non-demanding, the perceived pressure decreases, even if distance remains. And this is where internal recalibration begins. They start to reevaluate how your presence feels in their emotional space. Not through grand realizations, but through small contrasts. Conversations feel lighter. Interactions feel less pressured. Your absence feels less like tension and more like space. And in that space, something very subtle begins to form: the ability to think about you without immediate emotional resistance. Which brings the dynamic into the third trigger: living a visibly full life, but not in a performative way, in a natural one. Because what deepens emotional impact in avoidant dynamics is not pursuit, but perception of independence. When your life appears active, grounded, and internally complete without emotional dependency being the center of it, it creates a shift in how you are mentally categorized. You are no longer positioned as someone orbiting the relationship, you are positioned as someone existing beyond it. And that distinction matters deeply because the mind cannot easily hold on to someone as emotionally available in the same way when their presence is no longer structured around emotional dependency. Instead, they become harder to predict, harder to access, and therefore more mentally significant over time. And this is where something subtle but powerful begins to emerge. They don't miss you yet, but they start noticing you differently. Your absence is no longer just a gap in communication, it becomes a space where imagination begins to fill in what is no longer immediately visible. And imagination is where emotional curiosity quietly grows. Because when someone is no longer constantly defining themselves in your emotional field, your mind is forced to reassemble who they are without current input. And that reconstruction process is where attachment often begins to reactivate, not through interaction but through reinterpretation. But even then, this is not the final trigger. It is still just the early architecture of emotional reversal beginning to take shape in the background, long before it becomes visible on the surface. And once that internal reconstruction begins, something even more subtle takes over the dynamic. Attention itself starts to shift direction, not in a dramatic way, not in a sudden realization, but in a quiet reallocation of mental focus. Because when someone is no longer constantly engaging with your emotional presence, the mind doesn't just erase you, it repositions you. And that repositioning is where curiosity starts to grow. Small gaps in information become noticeable. Moments that used to be filled with your reactions now feel slightly open-ended. And instead of immediate emotional engagement, there is a pause, a space where interpretation replaces interaction. That pause is incredibly important because it is where the mind begins to do what it naturally does when something becomes less available. It starts filling in the missing emotional texture on its own, not through facts but through imagination. And imagination is where emotional attachment begins to quietly reassemble itself, not because you are actively present, but because you are no longer fully predictable. And this is where the fourth trigger begins to take shape, the subtle reversal of attention, not in a manipulative sense, not in a forced withdrawal of care, but in the natural redirection of focus away from emotional dependency and toward internal life, stability, and self-containment. Because what creates emotional recalibration in avoidant dynamics is not pursuit or explanation, but the moment they begin to sense that your attention is no longer orbiting around them in the same way. When you stop reacting to every shift, stop over-explaining every silence, stop filling every gap with emotional urgency, something important changes in how your presence is experienced. You become less of a reactive emotional environment and more of an independent emotional system. And that distinction is what triggers reflection, because for the first time they are no longer receiving constant emotional feedback that confirms their place in your internal world. Instead, they are faced with a version of you that exists without needing to continuously demonstrate attachment. And when that happens, something very specific begins to form in the background: emotional recalibration through absence of control. Because avoidant attachment patterns often operate with a low tolerance for emotional predictability that feels binding. When someone's presence becomes too emotionally centered around the relationship, it can unconsciously trigger withdrawal. But when that presence shifts into independence, calmness, and internal focus, it removes the sense of emotional pressure while simultaneously increasing psychological curiosity. And that curiosity is where missing begins to form, not as longing yet, but as recognition that something familiar is no longer being actively reinforced. And the mind, especially in attachment systems, does not ignore that shift. It begins tracking it quietly, measuring the difference between what was and what is now available. This is also where a deeper psychological mechanism comes into play: the loss of emotional control. Not control over you as a person, but control over predictability. When someone knows exactly how another person will respond emotionally at all times, the dynamic becomes stable but not memorable. However, when that predictability shifts even slightly, it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is what creates mental replay. They begin to think about interactions differently, not because they miss you immediately, but because the emotional pattern they were used to no longer behaves the same way. And when patterns change, the mind naturally tries to understand why. It revisits past interactions, reevaluates tone, reinterprets distance, and slowly begins constructing a revised emotional image of you that is no longer identical to the one they had before. And this is where the most important shift quietly begins to happen. Curiosity replaces indifference. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to alter internal engagement. Because indifference requires emotional saturation. Curiosity begins when saturation breaks. When emotional input becomes less frequent, the brain no longer processes the person as an always available presence. Instead, they become a variable, something that is no longer fully predictable, no longer fully accessible, and therefore no longer emotionally static. And once someone moves from static emotional category to variable emotional category, they begin to occupy more cognitive space. Not necessarily more emotional intensity at first, but more mental presence. And that mental presence is what slowly evolves into missing when combined with time and absence. But even at this stage, there is a critical misunderstanding most people fall into. They assume that once curiosity appears, the emotional outcome is guaranteed, that if someone starts thinking about you more, it automatically leads to reconnection. But in reality, this is only the opening phase of emotional recalibration. Because curiosity alone does not equal emotional return, it simply opens the door for reassessment. And what happens next depends entirely on whether that space is preserved or disrupted. If the moment curiosity appears is met with sudden emotional pressure, pursuit, or over-availability, the recalibration collapses. The system returns to familiarity and the emotional tension dissolves. But if that space remains steady, grounded, and non-reactive, then curiosity begins to deepen into something more persistent, something that starts to linger longer in thought, something that begins to surface even in moments where you are not directly present. And that is the quiet transition point where missing starts to form, not as a reaction but as a recurring presence in the background of their attention. And once that curiosity stops being a brief mental flicker and starts becoming something that returns again and again without invitation, the emotional landscape begins to shift in a way that is no longer about distance alone, but about internal presence. Because now you are no longer just not there in the physical or conversational sense. You are starting to occupy space in thought when there is no immediate trigger to justify it. And that is where the real transformation quietly happens. The mind begins replaying fragments of interaction not because it is forced to, but because it is trying to complete something that no longer feels fully resolved. Small moments that once felt ordinary begin to carry new weight in hindsight. A tone that used to go unnoticed now feels slightly different in memory. A silence that once passed easily now feels like it had more meaning than was originally assigned to it.